Upon booting Europa Universalis up for the first time, you might have questions like, what is an RGO? How does control work? How do I make money? Well, whether you have been following the dev diaries since day one or a complete beginner to strategy games in general, by the end of this video, you're going to have all the information you need to turn your country into an economic utopia. Or at least stop hyperinflation from happening. The economy and building systems in this game can be some of the most fun you can have in it, but it can be a little bit tricky. So to break things down even easier, in this video I've included timestamps at the bottom of the screen that breaks this category into individual topics. If you're confused by any of the other aspects of EU5, I'll have a playlist of tutorials pinned to the top of the comments, so go check it out. Now, let's figure out how to balance our books. To teach you about all things economy, we are going to be taking a look at England. This is where you can see the amount of money you'll make as well as the expenses that you incur. So we'll get to tax base and tax inefficiency and how they're calculated in a second. For now though, we can see that we have an income of 44.28 and expenditure of 26.84. The first thing here we have is minting. This is how much coinage that we're producing. If you know anything about 20th century Germany, you know whacking this up to maximum is going to give us a lot of money. I mean, literally 10x the amount we were making before almost, at the cost of inflation per month. Inflation, if you didn't know, is going to increase the cost of everything. Let's say a good costs 100 gold. If our inflation is 5%, it's now going to cost 105%. So minting can be good for short-term boosts of income, but you do want to bring it back down here. Generally speaking, you can adjust it a little bit to this kind of point where it's 0, or you can put it up a little bit more than that. Some of your primary source of income here are going to be the taxes on your various estates. As you may know, your population across your society is stratified into these different estates. And so here we have the lords, the clergy, the burgess, and the yeomanry. You can see that, for example, I can't increase tax beyond 29.75% over here. And for the clergy, I'm not allowed to tax them at all. If you hover over their names, then you can see exactly why that is. In this case, we are Catholics, then Catholics are not allowed to tax their clergy. Perhaps you want to switch to Protestantism, it might be a bit more lucrative for you. Whereas on the Lords side of things, there is the base value of 30%. We have our reform of English Parliament giving us a further 10%, and it's counterbalanced by the nobles' estate power. So the less power they have, the more we can tax them. In this case, for example, the yeomanry, we can tax them all the way up to 50%. So if you want to know exactly why there are maximum and minimum limits, you can see here. But as I do that, you'll start to see that that's going to annoy the estates. Exactly how to balance the estates I get to in my internal affairs tutorial. So for now, we're just going to be focusing on the economic side of things. If I hover over here, you can see where their money is coming from and how you're going to tax them. You can also automate all of this. Well, to be fair, you can automate your entire balance and then you won't be able to move any sliders and the AI will do all that for you. If you were to do this, then the AI is going to select a tax amount that is just about going to keep them loyal, like around here. And it's not a terrible idea to keep them like that, and then if you need short bursts of cash, whack them up. Then you have your trade income. You will either be buying or selling food, which is either going to gain you money or lose you money, depending if you're on a surplus or a deficit. And then we have our diplomacy. So these are coming from our vassals. This is very, very important in terms of making use of land versus sort of just taking large swathes. It'll make sense when I get to it, but for example, Aquitaine is going to be giving us more money from them controlling the territory and giving us money than we would make controlling this territory ourselves, at least until a late game. And then we have other sources of income. So for example, in this case, we have a Christian holy site, which makes a little bit of money. On the cost side of things, we have our legitimacy and our stability. This is going to scale with our tax base, so we'll touch on that in a second. Otherwise, we have our sliders for our navy, army, and fort maintenance. Again, these can be automated, and in times of war, they will shoot up automatically. Then finally down here, we have the buildings that we're paying for. For example, our cathedrals, we have 13 of those and they are costing us 2.42. And then if you hover over that, it will show you each one and why it's costing you that amount. So with the nested tooltips, it's really useful to see, for example, we are spending 0.11 ducats on 0.05 units of glass. And you don't need to get into the numbers to understand that, well, if I dropped the price of glass by increasing the amount of glass that was being produced in my country, then that would be brought down. And this is how I want you to start thinking about buildings and the economy in Europa Universalis 5. Because this is where a lot of the fun comes in. If you're purely reactive, then you're not going to have as much fun as if you're starting to plan things out. And then finally, we have the building subsidies. For example, we are supplying the Naval Supplies Guild over here because we're going to need those naval supplies, even though it's not itself profitable. Okay, so tax base. What is our tax base? Well, tax base is the amount of money we get from these locations. So for example, London over here has a tax base of 9.8. The higher your tax base, the more that the cost of the court and your stability costs. So if I hover over cost of the court, you can see that at 100% investment, it is 12.83, and that scales from 10% of our economic base, plus these 1% from the aristocratic court and 1% from the fact that we have a national value or societal value pushing slightly towards aristocracy. So the idea is, as you become larger and grow your tax base, your expenses like keeping up your stability and your legitimacy will also increase. Also, I completely glossed over diplomatic spending. I'll go more into the importance of diplomatic spending when we get into the diplomacy section, but for now, this is also scaled with our economic base. It's important to say that our economic base is slightly different from our tax base. Our economic base is our tax base plus the volume of our trades and also like things like sound tolls. Whereas our tax base is purely all of our locations numbers here. Okay, I'm gonna switch to the control map mode for a second and I'll explain what this is. But for now, know that over here, there is a difference between potential tax base and our actual tax base. In Truro, there is a potential tax base of 3.12, a third of London. This is quite a large place. However, because it scales with control, we actually have zero benefit from this location. And that doesn't factor in to this thing here. And finally, we have our tax efficiency. This is going to be a series of modifiers that you'll collect throughout the game. It'll also scale with your crown power, and that will, even though it doesn't tell you it here, that will affect how much tax you get. Let's keep it simple. If I was getting 1 ducat a month from the Lords and I had a tax efficiency of 10%, then I would get 1.1 ducat the following month as opposed to the previous one. So looking at effective tax base versus tax base, this is the control map mode, and we have a lot of different numbers. Control scales from 0 all the way up to 100. Your capital will always be 100. And you might start to see a trend here that is to a degree radiating outwards. Our control is radiating outwards from our capital, and that's because that is essentially what it does. If, for example, I were to take this province here, Lowestoft, I'm English, I should be able to pronounce that. We can see that it has a potential tax base of 4.75. However, it has an effective tax base of 2.58 because it's scaled with control. Control has a bunch of different effects. You can see that here. I can't think of a single reason why you wouldn't want 100% control in every location. And so that's something you'll want to try and strive towards. That is not going to be an achievable aim until much later in the game. I'm talking hundreds of years. But for now, know that the more control, the better. Because having 54% control means we get less of the economic benefit, and all of these things are scaled. We get fewer levies, we're able to have fewer people assimilate and convert to, in this case, Catholicism and the English culture. We get less manpower, and also, crucially, we have a lowered pop promotion speed. A pop promotion speed, in case you were wondering, is if I were to build, let's say, over here, a bunch of breweries, then we need burghers to staff them. This is going to put us in a deficit of 900 burghers. We need 900 individuals to go into this class of people, and it's going to bring it up slowly over time from there. But because of the control, that is going to be slowed by 57%. So what sort of things impact control? Well, if we hover over here, we can see that the maximum control is scaled due to it being a core. The proximity to the capital increases it by 0.35%, and the average satisfaction. So if people are happy, there'll be more control. If they are unhappy, less control. If it's a core territory means that more than 50% of the people living here, in Whitby it's 26,000, so roughly 13,000 and some change, are of the English culture or an accepted culture. So in this case, Northumbrian is an accepted culture, and therefore this place becomes our core. Which means even if we can't reach the territory, if it's our core, then we will still get 20% control as a base, and then the other modifiers will either increase it or hinder it. But this is the key part here, the proximity to capital. The further something is away to the capital, the further something is away from the capital, the harder it is for us to exert control over it. And you can see here that we have that 0.47%. The way proximity is calculated, and it's a different map mode here. That's the roads map mode, Laith. The way proximity is calculated is each province, including sea tiles, has a movement cost. So in this case, the lowest movement cost is to go from London into the Thames, then into the Anglican coast, then into the Humber Estuary, then up here into Flamborough Head. It's not a real place. And then Whitby. It is a real place. So you can start to see the importance of coastlines. The best way I can tell you about proximity is how hard is it to get to a place. For example, if it's over mountains, let's say Serbia, if I show off the proximity cost over here, the mountains are going to make life a lot harder. So you'll start to get the understanding that to exert control over territories, we want to get the proximity cost down as low as possible. And you'll see for some of these territories, we have basically no proximity. Hovering over the proximity, we can see all of the different steps. So London to Harrow costs 18 movement. And if you think 100 is the province itself, even Harrow itself is going to have minus 18.6%. So it's only got 81% proximity. And that's right next door to London. So you can start to understand how this sort of compounds. Hovering over why that is 18.64, we can find out that proximity cost through land is plus 40. There is a gravel road here, dropping it by a flat number of 20. The farmlands increase it by 5%, and then the development and the fact there's a bridge further reduce it, resulting in this score. So if I show you the roads map mode, we already have some roads being built up here. And that is going to make this proximity cost lower. But for the most part, the coastline was a lot easier to control. So over here, London, we can see, has a harbour capacity of 95%. It is very, very, very suitable. There's even a map mode, I think, for natural harbours. Yeah, there is. Natural harbour suitability. So you can see which provinces in the world have natural harbour suitability, which is going to help with this harbour capacity. And that harbour capacity is right here, going to reduce the proximity cost in the port. So looking at Newcastle, for example, which has a good harbour capacity, that reduces the proximity cost through port, and it's at minus 2% proximity, whereas the one next to it has minus 17%. Okay, so looking at projecting our control into the ocean here. If I want to increase my control over Yarmouth, for example, and reduce that proximity cost, what I need to be doing is having a maritime presence. If I select the sea tile, over here, there is a thing called Maritime Presence. There is a base level of decay of Maritime Presence, but essentially, the more Maritime Presence you have, the lower the proximity cost of going into the sea tile, the easier it is. So if I go over here to my Maritime Presence map mode, and to be clear, I believe blue is good and green is bad. I don't know why it was done like that. Yeah, you can see here 0% is green and blue is 100%, so it's really hard to tell. But if I have this Maritime Presence up really high, it's going to lower that proximity cost and help me to project control. Which explains why over here, even though it's across the sea tile, I have 23 control and 35% proximity to the capital versus something on the same island just a few provinces away. We are now going to compare that to the year 1807. We are almost 500 years into the future. Now, this was an observer game that I did just to see what the AI would do. So this isn't my game. I want to make that very clear. And you can see the control is a lot better. Up here in Newcastle, we have 90 control. A base of 70 to be fair, so it's going to tick down. But that proximity cost is way less. From London into the Thames is now 0.01. And you can see that's because of the development. There's a bridge there, the harbour capacity, centralization, societal value, and also the technology. Going for this proximity map mode again, and this is very, very different. We have modern roads here, and the development helps out. And we're back in 1337 with a lot less control. You can use buildings to help out with that. For example, if I build a temple, it's going to give plus 5% control. Things like a royal forest will also help out in rural settlements, as well as having urban settlements. For example, Coventry is a town and therefore gives another 5%. Bordeaux, for example, is a city, so it gives 10%. Okay, so we've established that control is important. So let me now take you through this entire screen. At a glance, we can see the fortifications, the amount of people living here, as well as how happy they are. The market access, which is very, very important. For example, if the market access over here is 84%, that means that a building like this tools guild, if this location had 100% market access, it would produce one tool unit, input good, whatever you want to call it, one unit of tools. However, right now it only makes 0.85. Then we have the control, which we discussed, and then we have the RGO. These are the raw materials in the world. Every single province has one raw material. Each of these goods has a base price, which is dynamically changed with trade and the markets. I'll get more into that on the trading side of things. But for example, London has 3 levels of wheat, which employs 3,000 laborers and makes 0.66 profit per level. We'll get into more of how to use these RGOs effectively in a second. But then we move on to the development. Development is very important. At the top here, you can see how much it's changing by and what's going to impact those things. And then down here, the effectiveness of it. So for example, a development of 34 results in you can have more buildings. Buildings also cost less. People are more likely to move there. Essentially, the more development, the better. People also live longer here, which I quite like. One thing that impacts our development is our prosperity. So a more prosperous place is going to drive up development. Then here we have our works of art. Then in this tiny little icon here, we can see how many buildings we A, have and B, can support. So we have 25 buildings here. We can support 144. The number of institutions that we have here, the food productivity, as well as the amount of food. So we can see the food units produced and the food units consumed, which actually balances out quite nicely here. However, we can't have people starving, and so we will get that 0.09 food from the London market. More rural places, as you can see here, will produce more food, whereas urban places generally tend to consume food because you have fewer people in subsistence farming. And individuals are like the burgers, for example, they're busy making things like tools, and so they aren't going to be producing food, they'll only consume it. Also, different pops consume different food. For example, 1,000 nobles need 20 food, whereas each 1,000 peasants only needs 1 food. So as you get more and more burgers, for example, you need to have more food available to them from different locations. That's determined on a market level. And so over here in London, we can see that we have a monthly balance of plus 2,000 food. If that goes below, people are going to start starving and you'll have to start importing food. So going back to our balance, you can see that we actually end up selling food. Whereas let's say a nation like Holland, which is smaller and much more urbanized, is going to be buying food. So if an urban settlement is going to cost me food and I'm gonna have to buy it, why would I ever want to have an urban environment? That's because you're gonna make a lot of money here. For example, this wheat RGO per level makes 0.66 profit. However, this Distillers Guild, which has these inputs and produces, I think it's just called alcohol, we'll sell that for a lot more. And the important thing here, it will create profit for you to then be able to tax your estates, and as well as the fact that they are purchasing goods on the market. So they're purchasing pottery and purchasing glass. Then the money doesn't just disappear. It's being reinvested into your own economy. I don't need to give you an economics lesson for this to become clear. If I have a glass guild in Colchester over here, for example, that's producing glass, it's going to sell those on the market. The guys here are going to be buying it. Everyone's making profit and everyone's paying back into me. That is going to increase our tax base, because tax base isn't just the amount of people. It's calculated by the combined profit of your RGOs and buildings in a location. So let's take a look at these buildings more closely. If you select up here, production, you can click on this buildings tab, and then you can see a bunch of buildings that you can produce. Hovering over each one will tell you exactly what the inputs are in terms of production method. We'll get to that in a second, as well as what each of these things do. It's important to distinguish between rural settlements and urban ones. This over here in Barking is a rural settlement. You can tell by this little dot up here, which means it has a higher RGO size, and I cannot build urban buildings there. So for example, that Distillers Guild can't happen in Barking. Unless, of course, I spend the money to found a town. Both with buildings and things with founding towns, the cost of doing these actions or building a building has a base cost. It's then affected by the inflation, as we discussed earlier, and then you have the input goods. For example, masonry and lumber is cheaper on the English market, and therefore I have a massive reduction on how much this is going to cost. It should cost 500, it's actually going to cost 400, and that's the same thing with buildings. For example, if I want to build a brewery over here, I can see that's going to cost 30, the base cost is 45. That has been scaled down by the development in the location, my ruler's admin ability, and then is further scaled down by the masonry. So think to yourself, cheap construction goods means cheap construction. And if you like this kind of stuff, you'll already be starting to think, okay, well, here's one strategy that I can do. Here's what I can, maybe if I build a load of wood RGOs. If I go over here and click goods, I'm going to type in lumber, and I'm going to build a load of lumber to make lumber super cheap in this market to make future constructions a lot easier. Or you can import a load of cheap lumber at a loss to facilitate construction a lot easier in your country. But that is for trade. So we're going to look at the Spinners Guild, which is my favorite building for the UK. The reason for this is this production method. Different buildings have the possibility of having different production methods. Some are unlocked by technology. For example, for right now, the Papers Maker Guild can either use leather and lumber to create 0.5 paper, or it could use fiber crops and lumber to create 1 paper. This one over here, rag paper, which would use cloth and lumber, will be unlocked with technology. By default, the game selects the most profitable production method for you because of this. This is not a bad thing to have on. But as always with this game, the most profitable isn't necessarily the best. Let's say I have the technology for rag paper and I have a booming cloth industry. Well, then I want to switch over my paper making guild to rag paper. Even though it makes paper more expensive to produce, it facilitates a demand for my cloth, which employs more people, more tax, yada yada. So looking at the Spinners Guild, we can also make cloth with cotton, something that we don't have right now, but will be abundant when we go through the whole colonization thing. So I'll give you an example. If I were to colonize and get a load of cotton, I could flood the markets of Europe with very, very cheap cloth because cotton is better than wool for producing cloth. I like to do this even earlier because the reason that I like Spinners Guild so much as England is because of wool. Wool is everywhere in England, and you start off with a ton of these RGOs. This means that for me to produce cloth, it is very, very cheap. And that also means that later on I can produce paper with cheap cloth, meaning cheap paper, and everyone's employed. The game will try and estimate the profit here. If I sort by the amount of profit it's going to make, London's the most profitable at 2.5, and we're going to get 100% of the benefit from that because of our control, versus somewhere like Berwick, which is going to be making 1.24, but we're going to lose 93% of that due to the low control. So generally speaking, you want your buildings concentrated around your capital, in your capital, because that's where you're going to get the most amount of benefit from them. So the game will try and tell you what it thinks the most profitable things are for you to build. Same thing with goods, and it'll show you how much you're going to make per level. But like I said, let's say I want to go into tooling industries and I want to drop the price of tools and sell tools, then I'm going to need cheap iron. So I'm going to prioritize iron, even though it won't make me as much as horses because of those supply chains. It'll also tell you what your pop needs are here. For example, our pops really want fruit. So it might be an idea to get fruit, even though it's less profitable just to secure those population needs, to make people happy, get them to pay more taxes, less likely to join rebel groups, as well as increase our development. Another thing you might want to note is that you can get even more efficiency by putting the right buildings in the right locations when it comes to RGOs. For example, in London, we have wheat, which means this distillery actually gets a bonus because we are distilling wheat. If I hover over production efficiency, we get plus 9% because there's wheat in Middlesex. So for example, a Spinners Guild over here in Lynn is going to have plus 10% efficiency, whereas a Spinners Guild in London isn't going to have those same bonuses. But as a consequence, we're only going to get 38% of the profits. So let's go a little bit more advanced. Why would I want to use Vassals? Well, up here in Berwick, this is not an integrated territory. So we need to use a cabinet action to integrate it. This takes a long time. Berwick is a sole territory. It has 50,000 people in it, which is quite a lot to be fair. Especially at the start of the game, with a bunch of bonuses, it's still going to take us a good sort of 7 years or so. And that's for one province. So down here, I have diplomatically annexed Aquitaine using console commands. And so all these areas are already integrated, but we get zero control from them. We don't get any benefit from this at all. And so all this territory gives me is unhappy individuals and areas to defend. However, if I navigate to the relations screen and I create a subject, I can create Aquitaine as a fiefdom. You'll see that they actually enjoy a decent amount of control of their land because their capital's here, so that proximity cost is a lot lower. And instead of that roughly 0 ducats I was getting from the territory before, Aquitaine is now giving me 3.46. So in areas that I can't project good amounts of control into, particularly inland areas, I want to be using vassals to get the most out of an area until I can project control into an area. The final thing I'll say about control, if we're going a bit more in depth, is so very broad macro strategy. You want to increase your control through reducing the proximity cost of areas, so increasing the proximity to capital through things like the road builder and building roads. You want to improve your maritime presence to project control into the ocean and prioritize taking land that you can push control into. For example, this north coast of France, it's 2 sea tiles. I could probably better project into there than Skipton. For areas further afield, using vassals is paramount. If you do want to boost the productivity of your buildings, then lowering the price of the input goods will give you a lot more profit. And as always, make sure to get as much crown power as possible to benefit from that as much as possible. The other thing you need to look out for in terms of control are things like stannery courts. This is an example of a building that an estate will build that will lower your maximum control, because the estates will also be building this entire time. Sometimes they'll be building things that will help you, and sometimes they might build things that are going to hinder your control. Hopefully that has given you an understanding of the economy of your nation and how to get going in building in Europa Universalis 5. If you want to figure out how to further develop your economic skills, then make sure to check out the trade tutorial as well. There'll be a link in the comments down to... I've made other tutorials in Europa Universalis 5, so if you want to see any of those, there'll be a link in the comments to the playlist down below. Otherwise, if you're interested in more Europa Universalis 5 content, make sure to like the video and subscribe, and I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.